Welcome back. This is week 12, lecture 1, the Reformation of the Later Middle Ages. And this is a lecture, in the next lecture for this week, lecture 2 for this week as well, form sort of a unit, but they also go together with the previous lecture from last week, from week 11, lecture 2, dealing with the crisis of the Later Middle Ages. Because for me, and I've written extensively about this, the crisis of the later Middle Ages and the Reformation of the later Middle Ages are more or less one and the same. They refer to the same series of events and developments. The term itself can be confusing because the Reformation, in terms of European society, is traditionally seen as a 16th century development, beginning with Martin Luther, and as one of the major movements that led from the transition from medieval forms of life and governments and cultures to early modern. And so the Reformation stands at the origins of the emergence of modernity. And how I use the term Reformation of the later Middle Ages in a way that can be confusing, because for me, we need to see what happens in the 16th century, which I'll be talking a little bit more about in the next lecture, in light of what has happened in the 14th and 15th centuries. And so the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, for me, covers the period from approximately 1300 to approximately 1530, and we'll see why that's the case next lecture, which can also be referred to as the crisis of the later Middle Ages, because when there are calls for reformation, not just for reform, not just for making things better, but for completely reforming things, everything from governmental structures and organization to ecclesiastical life to lay life and the whole shebang, so to speak. Calls for reformation are pretty serious, and they don't come about unless there is a crisis. So that's kind of how the two fit together, that the call for reformation is a response to a perceived crisis when things are not working. And what we always had assumed was the case is no longer the case, as I discussed in the last lecture. So what I want you to realize is that the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, which for me goes up through the early Luther, again, I'll talk more about that next lecture, is synonymous with the crisis of the later Middle Ages, which is distinct from what traditionally has been called the Reformation of the 16th century. Part of this late medieval crisis, as I'll be talking about too, is what has traditionally been referred to as the Renaissance. The Renaissance and Reformation have been seen often traditionally as the two movements or developments that led to modernity, or at least the emergence of modernity in early modern Europe, moving away from the Middle Ages and this kind of transformation of and change of paradigm from medieval culture to early modern culture. I'll talk more about this shortly, but for me, the Renaissance was a late medieval development. It was part of an ongoing process of change, calls for reformation, and should not be seen as something distinct from what was the Reformation of the later Middle Ages. And so I treat the Renaissance as part of the Reformation of the later Middle Ages for reasons that I hope will become clear when I get there. Now, this lecture, again, parallels the previous lecture in terms of the crisis of the later Middle Ages. And so we see these working together. I could have put it all together and had it just as part 1 and part 2 maybe. But I wanted to do this distinctly to see conceptually what was going on and to see that some of these developments of the Reformation of the later Middle Ages were certainly late medieval developments. And rather than the decline thesis, which I think I talked a little bit about last lecture too, it is more saying this period of the later Middle Ages is not necessarily a period of decline, it's a period of just transformation and development. And in some ways, in opposition to the decline thesis, and this goes back actually to the 60s, a Dutch historian, Jan Huizinga, wrote a great book with the English title, The Harvest of Medieval Theology. And that is really, or no, excuse me, not medieval theology, the harvest of the Middle Ages. The harvest is a time of culmination, and it's the end of the agricultural year. So what he's really referring to is this is a development that is the culmination, not the decline. And that prepares the way for something new to come. And in some ways, that is the take that I bring to this. But rather than seeing that shift only happening in the 16th century, we need to see the developments preceding it and leading up to it. And as I'll be portraying Luther in the next lecture, if you haven't heard of Luther, that's okay, you will. He was both the culmination of the Reformation of the later Middle Ages and the beginning of something new. So I just want to be clear in terms of the terms and what they refer to, or what they signify as I use them. And I will try to keep myself on track, so to speak, because I can easily get sidetracked. Because number one, I know a lot about this, and as I said, I've written a lot about this. And number two, I think it's so exciting what's going on. So that's kind of the context. So within that late medieval crisis that I talked about last lecture, we're going to look at some different aspects of that crisis under the term the Reformation of the later Middle Ages. To do that, we need to go back to the beginning, so to speak, and talk about some of the developments or the other parts of the developments within the imperial papal conflict, which I talked about last time, between Boniface VIII and Philip IV of France, and then John XXII and Louis of Bavaria, the emperor. And I think I mentioned with Boniface that there was an Augustinian hermit by the name of Giles of Rome who wrote in support of Boniface. Now, Giles of Rome was an Augustinian hermit, and I talked about the origins of the mendicants and the Augustinian hermits in the lecture before the midterm. And, sorry, my dog is coming in again. You can see his tail there. And we can begin to see the complex of factors because traditionally, dealing with Luther, as we'll see next lecture, the issue of Augustinianism, an undefined term, was a major contributing factor to Luther. The appeal to Augustine of Hippo and the theology of Augustine of Hippo, particularly his anti-Pelagian theology, was seen as a direct cause or catalyst for Luther. And so there's been a lot of scholarship focusing on to what extent did Luther develop his Augustinian theology based on his own reading of Augustine, and to what extent did he develop it based on the order of hermits of St. Augustine, of which he was a member. Again, we'll talk about that next lecture, but so this is kind of setting that up as well. And a term that has been used is the Augustinian Renaissance. And that's a term that I use as well. It's just an issue of understanding what it was. And it's not necessarily this theological movement, but it is more of a religio-political movement in the context of returning to Augustine. And it really begins with Giles of Rome and then his successors in the context of this ecclesiastical conflict between the emperor and the pope, or the king of France and the pope. That's what the context here is. So, Giles of Rome, as I mentioned before, was a colleague, an associate of Benedict Gaetani, even before he became Pope Boniface VIII. When Boniface VIII started having problems, and the Colonna cardinals and Philip IV were all claiming that his election wasn't valid, Giles of Rome wrote the treatise to defend his position and to provide the legal and theological basis for resigning the papacy, which was a big deal. No one had actually resigned the papacy before. And so that whole aspect of Giles of Rome supporting the position of Boniface, and he did so originally as the prior general of the whole order, led to a close association of the Augustinians with the papacy. And when Boniface had his problems with Unam Sanctam, he turned to Giles. And Giles, already being aware of the conflicts and the problems, in 1301 or 1302, writes this treatise on ecclesiastical power, which became to be seen as the most radical form of papal hierocratic theory of the Middle Ages. Now, what's hierocratic theory is hierarchy. It's a theory of hierarchy, and with the Pope being at the top. And so Giles has been seen as the foundation of papal hierarchical theory, even though it was developed before. I talked about the emergence of papal monarchy under Innocent III in the 13th century, so it's not that some of these ideas were completely new. But Boniface used Giles's treatise on ecclesiastical power, at times word for word, for his bull Unam Sanctam, which I discussed last time. And he started privileging the Augustinian hermits as an order. And that just continued with the conflict between Pope John XXII and Louis of Bavaria, not with Giles. Giles died in 1316, but with another Augustinian hermit, Augustinus of Ancona, whom I think I mentioned briefly last lecture too. Augustinus of Ancona wrote his comprehensive treatment of ecclesiastical power for John XXII in the conflict with Louis of Bavaria. I think I mentioned that Augustinus of Ancona was the chaplain of Robert of Anjou. And even though you can read the treatise, his Summa de Potestate Ecclesiastica, as also criticizing the Pope and warning John, as I think I mentioned last time. John just focused on the positive aspects, so to speak, of what he wanted to see. And there, when Augustinus says that, yes, the Pope can empty purgatory, and yes, the Pope has all the power of Christ. John says, yes, and yes, we must follow even bad popes. He didn't pay attention to Giles's warning when he says, yes, but if the Pope does empty purgatory, he errs. Or if, can he live anywhere? Yes, but by, his pastoral responsibilities as Bishop of Rome means he must live in Rome necessarily. And John was living in Avignon. And on we could go. So that is the context. I think I also mentioned that Augustinus, even though he does not cite Marsilius of Padua as defensor pacis, or defender of the peace, was clearly responding to it. Because Marsilius, as I talked about last lecture, had called for the abolition of the papacy. So that is, let's say, Marsilius's treatment is the most radical form of imperial political theory. Giles of Rome, and then even more so Augustinus of Ancona, in his Summa, or his comprehensive treatment of ecclesiastical power, represents the epitome of the papal side, the hierocratic theory, as it's called, from the hierarchy. So you have the papal and the imperial in conflict, and they're arguing against each other. Now, Augustinus' Summa has never been translated. There's a volume of collections on political theory in the later Middle Ages that has a couple of selections from it, translated but not much. It has never been edited in a modern critical edition. It's an extensive work, and it's the most comprehensive work on ecclesiastical power and the power of the papacy that had been written to that point, and in some ways that has ever been written. It's a major work, and it's a major lacuna that work has not been edited and translated. When it has been discussed, it is focused on the first two parts. It's in three parts. The first two parts, kind of like with Marsilius of Padua, the focus is on the power of the papacy itself. It doesn't really look at the whole context of what this work was all about. I'm not going to go into further details there, but I just want to give you the sense that this is a more extensive work, the Summa, written explicitly in opposition to Marsilius, which causes tension. It just exacerbates the already political, and then with John XXII and Boniface, the military conflict between the emperor and the pope. John was very happy, and what he did, as I may have mentioned this before, for Augustinus' Summa, is he gave him a gift of 100 golden florins. Anyway, I gave him a bunch of money, a big chunk of change. And he said he would continue to give him an annual salary if he would continue writing for him. Now, in this same context, basically, another scholar, Bartholomew of Urbino, Augustinian hermit, completed a work that Augustinus of Ancona had begun, and that work is known as the Milliloquium Sancti Augustini. Now, the Milliloquium, or the Thousand Sayings of Augustine, was not completed until the early 1340s. So after John the 22nd and Louis of Bavaria were both gone and had died after the major conflict there. But it was started by Augustinus. Now, that's my asserting that. That is a debatable point, and since Augustinus really hasn't been studied that much, it could be proven perhaps if anybody really went into it, and even I have not really gone into that question. It just based to the extent that I have, I think there's evidence to suggest indeed, until further research, that this work, the Milliloquium, was begun by Augustinus of Ancona. So what Augustinus is doing, he's returning to a study of Augustine, the works of Augustine, to write his Summa. And that then was completed by Bartholomew of Urbino. There'll be a connection, which we see with the Italian Renaissance in a minute. But then I have up here on the slide Augustine, father, teacher, leader, and head of the OESA, because when Augustinus wrote, he was already chaplain. A couple of other Augustinian hermits at the time also wrote treatises supporting John the 22nd. And not only did he give Augustinus this hunk of change and promised to keep giving him a salary, he also gave things paid off, let's say the other Augustinians writing for him, including William of Cremona, who was the prior general. And William of Cremona was the person to whom John the 22nd turned to refute 5 propositions drawn from Marsilius of Padua's Defensor Pacis. So what John's response to Marsilius of Padua, and then also the Sachsenhausen appeal of Louis, which I talked about last time, was to say, okay, Father William, you're the head of the Augustinian order. The Augustinians and the papacy has been allied very closely since Boniface and Giles. Refute this treatise, but this is a massive treatise, so I've had my people pick out the 5 most important points or arguments of it, and then I want you to provide the refutation. And William of Cremona does that in 1326. And what did he receive? Well, he received the granting by John for the order of Hermits of St. Augustine to have custody of Augustine's tomb in Pavia. And this gets to be a long story, but after Augustine died in Hippo in 430, going all the way back, his body was translated, as it says, first to Sardinia, and then finally to Pavia, which was also an imperial city, and it was buried in the Church of St. Peter's in Pavia. And over the centuries, and when John was making this grant to William of Cremona, and so in 1327, which is when it was, the Church of St. Peter's in Pavia was under the auspices of the Augustinian canons, which I talked about. William of Cremona, in sending this treatise to John to refute Marsilius of Padua, which John used in his bull condemning Marsilius, also said, okay, John, I have a question for you. Shouldn't the Augustinian hermits be in charge of Augustine's tomb? And John said yes. And so in January of 1327, John issues a bull, Veneranda Sanctorum, granting custody of Augustine's tomb to the hermits, where it had been the canons. And actually, he said the canons have to share it with the hermits, because the hermits are the true sons and heirs of their father, teacher, leader, and head, Augustine. That's up there on the PowerPoint. And that was the first time that phrase, leader, teacher, father, and head, referring to Augustine with respect to the Order of Hermits of St. Augustine, had been used. That became a commonplace reference. And there was a conflict between the canons and the Augustinian hermits over which order was the true and genuine order of St. Augustine. And that is part of the context of not only Augustinus's Milliloquium, but then Bartholomew of Urbino's returning and completing the work, returning to Augustine. Like, if we are going to be Augustine's true sons, or later as it was called, the embodiment of Augustine. Augustine is our head, we are his body. we are affecting a rebirth of Augustine. Now, Augustine had always been known. He's always been seen as one of the greatest church fathers, but he was known by quotable quotes. He was known indirectly, and some direct knowledge too. But what the Augustinians, hermits, did was say we need to know Augustine better than anybody else, i.e. Augustine's works. And this led to all kinds of fun developments and conflicts between the canons and the hermits that extended throughout the later Middle Ages on until Luther's time and then some, over which order was the most genuine, authentic order of St. Augustine. And the hermits basically won out on that one. There's a lot I could talk about this because this has been, as I said, the focus of my research. Now, that returning to Augustine is a return to the sources. It is the call in Latin was ad fontes, which becomes a call for the Italian Renaissance, as I'll get to in a minute. And that really begins in context of this conflict with the canons by the hermits. I mean, it starts with the hermits returning to Augustine, and the Augustinian hermits became the best scholars of Augustine in the later Middle Ages, knowing him better than anybody else, and citing him very precisely in an academic textual analysis that led to a reevaluation and a reappropriation of Augustine's also anti-Pelagian theology. In the last point, the anti-Pelagianism and the Augustinian theology in the later Middle Ages. And this goes all the way back to the Pelagian controversy, which I talked about with Augustine way back when, in terms of the primacy of grace, the lack of good works, the asserting of predestination, that how humans cannot, in and of themselves, do anything worthy of merit or of salvation. Now, this is the context, and it becomes a conflict of theology based on this crisis of the later Middle Ages. And what was developing, which I'll talk more about next lecture, was a pastoral attempt, not by the Augustinian hermits, even though they later kind of participated in this attempt too, but in response to the plague, response to, I'll talk about shortly, this great schism, all the crises that are going on. The idea was we need to be better Christians, and we need to motivate people to live Christian lives and better Christian lives. Because part of the problem with the plague, anyway, as I talked about, was what's the cause? It must be divine punishment. And why would we be being punished? Because we're not doing our jobs. I mean, the priests aren't doing their jobs, and we are not confessing enough. We're not living good enough Christian lives. And so this theology developed that God would give grace, but only to those who really are trying, who are really doing their best. And that was the phrase that began to be used and repeated. To those doing what is in them, God will not deny his grace. I mean, you just have to try. You have to try your best. And I'll talk more about this next lecture. But this was the very opposite view of the Augustinian position of predestination and grace by the Augustinians. So there's conflict between theological visions for how to live a Christian life and what was it all based on. And in the later Middle Ages and on into the 15th century, in the later 15th century, the Augustinian position fell by the wayside. And Luther basically had no understanding of it. He had no knowledge of the theology of his own order. But again, that'll be something for next time. So that's where this comes in. You think, but this is an abstract concept. And yes, it is. And it's theological. It's not historical. Yes, it is. But it's also historical, and it's also political, because it becomes one of the major elements of Luther's critique and eventually campaign against the hierarchy of Rome and against the papacy itself. That will be something we'll see next time. But here, this provides the basis for it. But this Augustinian Renaissance, this attempt to effect a rebirth of Augustine and Augustine's teachings and doctrines, led to this renewed scholarly erudition with respect to the sources of Augustine. And this call ad fontes became, too, the calling card slogan of the Italian Renaissance, and there are connections there. So now I'm going from the Augustinian Renaissance to the Italian Renaissance. Now, the Renaissance, I have taught, and there is a course in the books that hasn't been taught for quite a while, an entire course, the Renaissance, just like there's an entire course, the Reformation, which I teach basically every year. The Renaissance has often been misunderstood and misportrayed. This goes back to the whole issue, which I think I've referred to before, in terms of the Middle Ages as the Dark Ages and as backwards and not thinking, because the Italian humanists, and I'll be talking what that means shortly, in an attempt to portray themselves as doing something new and important, denigrated what had all come from the past. Now, what they viewed as being reborn was not Augustine, but the classical tradition. They viewed themselves as affecting a rebirth of classicism from ancient Rome and ancient Greece. It was first primarily ancient Rome. The Greek only came in later, which I'll say more about that too later. And the figure who has often been seen as the father of the Italian Renaissance was a man by the name of Petrarch, Francesco Petrarca, or just commonly known as Petrarch. And Petrarch had very close connections with members of the Augustinian hermits. So there's almost this one-to-one connection. And Petrarch wrote this work called My Secret, which is a dialogue between himself and Augustine. And basically in that treatise, it ends with Petrarch saying, I've been devoted to you since my birth. You're the person I look up to the most. Yet I can't follow what you say. And that's, it takes us too far afield here to go into that too much. Petrarch was more interested in fame and his devotion to his beloved Laura, whom he loved from afar. Laura was an Italian woman whom he was in love with, but she was already married, blah, 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 blah. There's a lot of very important aspects of Petrarch, but I wanted to emphasize here the connection between the Augustinian hermits and Petrarch. I could say a lot more about that, but Petrarch was not an Augustinian hermit, but he was very close friends with some of them. And he's also part of this movement called humanism. He's been seen as not only the father of the Renaissance, but the father of humanism, and that goes together. Now, just something about humanism, because that too has been so often misunderstood. There's something more contemporary in the 60s or so, and probably even developed earlier, probably comes out of the Enlightenment, that is referred to as secular humanism. Placing in opposition a religious view of the world and a humanistic view of the world. That dichotomy was completely foreign to anything in the Middle Ages or even in early modern Europe. We're talking about Renaissance humanism. We're not talking about a secularism, because what does secular mean? It just means of the world. Augustine's whole discussion was about the saeculum, the world, the Christian life in this world during our own temporal thing, before we die and go to heaven. And so it's not a place in opposition to religious or theological understandings. It is simply saying the world that we're in is the saeculum, is the secular world. Monks, as I think I talked about it before, we talked about monasticism and then the mendicants as well, and then the priesthood, were regulars, not seculars, in that they were priests who followed a monastic rule, and the early monks from the Benedictine tradition viewed themselves as withdrawing from the world. The mendicants were sent into the world based on Christ's admonition, go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every people. That was kind of one of the basis for the mendicants' missionary activity. And they came into a lot of conflict with the parish clergy, which I'll talk about a little bit as well, a little bit more. So this term humanism is not an issue in terms of the secular humanism as it's now used, which is in explicit opposition to religious or theological issues. What humanism at this time meant was looking at the classical tradition, the humanities. I have up there on the slide the Studia Humanitatis. I should have put that in italics because it's an Italian or Latin phrase. The Studia Humanitatis, or the study of the humanities, What the Italian Renaissance brought about was a reform, if not reformation, of traditional education. And it caused a crisis in terms of what is education? How do we teach people? In so many ways, very similar or analogous, not similar, but analogous to some of the issues that we're talking about here between the liberal arts and the STEM subjects. What makes for, something that is positive and needed? There's conflicts within the universities and lower level educations, elementary education, pre-university education, of what should be taught and how it should be taught. And the Renaissance humanists were teachers of the humanities. The humanities were not part of the university curriculum. It was based on Aristotle. Now, there's some humanists who also followed Aristotle. So we talk about a humanistic Aristotle. It can be very complex. But the point here is this was an entire education and scholarly movement that was distinct from and in many ways in opposition to the traditional university system and structures. So it does cause a crisis. What do you do? The humanities, what we call it humanities for them, were the liberal arts. History, literature, poetry, ethics. Now, there were beginning to be lectures on Aristotle's ethics at the university, but they were always approached in a very scholastic way. I know that term doesn't mean a great deal to you, but it's that question and answer, that very logical issue also of debate. What do we do with Aristotle's ethics? Because Aristotle's ethics is almost antithetical to Christian ethics. How do we deal with that? And it was not really taught as such at the universities. History wasn't a subject. Poetry wasn't a subject. And the whole point of the Italian Renaissance, from Petrarch on, it even has earlier origins, was to focus on classical models. Now, when I say earlier origins, it's not that just Petrarch was born and started saying, let's return to the classical tradition. It really has humanism, this return to classical models, has its origins in the Italian city-states of the late 13th century. And why? Because if you are a city secretary or a leader of a city, you have to enter into diplomacy. There's a lot of legal issues. There's a lot of debate going on. And diplomacy, that's just what is debate. Who was the greatest orator who's ever lived? Cicero. Who was the greatest poet who ever lived? Virgil. So the point was, in terms of practical attempts to be successful in your diplomatic efforts, you need to convince someone. You need to persuade them of your position. How do you go about doing that? With rhetoric. Logic is important, but rhetoric is more important. We have the term today, or it used to be thrown around, mere rhetoric. It means it's like, that's emptiness and let's look at the substance. For the Renaissance humanists, rhetoric was everything. Their phrase was, it is better to do the good than to know the truth. If you want to have good citizens, just get them to behave well. Have them be good citizens, which is more important than whether or not they know it. How many of you, I know I do this, know something that's true, but we don't follow it? I do it all the time. In terms of, let's say, what's good for you. Do I do things that are bad for me? Absolutely, constantly. Why do I do that? Things that are against my own self-interest, at least in terms of health. Why do I do that? I know the truth. I'm not deluded about the truth, but I don't want to do what is, quote unquote, best for me. I eat too much. I smoke, and I know that's not healthy. I'm not stupid. I don't pretend that it's not an issue. I know that it is, but I do it anyway. I don't care what the truth is. I do it. And the humanists said that's insanity. So the whole educational program of the universities was based on logic. The whole basis of humanist education was based on rhetoric, persuading people of what to do and how to live. Now, within that context, they also looked to human nature. Every Renaissance humanist was a devout Christian without even questioning it. They became very critical of the clergy. I'll be talking more about that shortly too. Of the priests, the bishops, the hierarchy, but not of Christianity at all. And there was even a whole attempt to develop a humanist theology. And we'll talk more about that next lecture too with Luther, because he's the inheritor of that. And a lot of the reformers were humanists. So that's where we're going with some of this. And that needs to be understood and seen in this context of the mid 14th century, from the earliest of origins in the city-states and diplomacy in the late 13th century, until we get to Petrarch, who becomes the first poet laureate designate since antiquity. And he writes one of the first epic poems in Latin based on classical models. This whole approach to say we need to follow and imitate Cicero and Virgil, just as the Augustinian hermits were imitating Augustine. That is the connection there, a return to the sources. And it has its effect. And it is part of what I refer to as the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, or the late medieval crisis of the later Middle Ages, rather than as an instigator of modernity. And this gets back to the whole problem and issue of determining historical change. If we only see it as precursors to later developments, we're not going to understand it in its own terms at the time. That's what kind of some of this about is as well. And my term, the Reformation of the later Middle Ages, is about that as well. It's not just about what led to the changes that came about in the 16th century. It's like, what is going on at the time? And there was this urgent call for reformation in many different aspects and facets. And that brings me to this sense, too, of why are there calls for reformation? Again, not just reform, but reformation. Is, as I talked about last time, the world was falling apart. We had this whole problem of, the crisis in the sense of what we'd always assumed was the way the world worked. It was no longer working. So what do we do about it? How do we deal with this? And I talked about last time the famine, the plague, war, death, and the apocalypse, the four horses of the apocalypse. And that sense of the world is falling apart and coming to an end was just increasing. It was increasing too because they felt that they could no longer trust their priests. I have their anti-clericalism. Anti-clericalism is not being against Christianity. It's saying that these damn priests aren't doing their jobs. I think I mentioned the flagellants in the last lecture. The sense of the priests are failing us. And whom do we rely on most of all? The priests. They should be the people we can count on and go to for help. That's one of the reasons, too, the whole issue of the pedophilia within the Catholic hierarchy has been such an issue, because the very people we should be able to trust most completely have, some of them, completely betrayed that trust. It's almost worse than out there. No, that's not my comment about pedophilia or about the Catholic clergy. And I'm not going to go into those issues, but there's, I don't think, any higher level of pedophilia in the Catholic clergy than there is in normal society, and probably even less. But it becomes so emphasized and celebrated because of the perversity. It's perverse anyway, but because of anybody, priests should not be pedophiles. And the sense that the priests are failing means that our whole basis for salvation is gone. How do we know how to do? How do we know how to deal with everything? And that just leads to the very feeling of, and makes even worse, this feeling of the signs of the times, the rising apocalypticism of the world's ending. It must be. We see the signs of the four horsemen have been loosed. The end of the world is near. And those feelings, from the beginnings with the famine and the plague, apocalypticism, there's been waves, but the famine and the plague, and then all the political problems Marsilius of Padua calling for the abolition of the papacy, which wasn't widely known, but among intellectual circles it certainly was. And then the rise of, on a popular level, of anti-clericalism, these damn priests. What do? We need a complete reformation if there's going to be any hope. Only got worse. Because, and I referenced this last lecture, I said I would come back to it today, I did. The Pope, too, in terms of anti-clericalism, was no longer in Rome. He was in Avignon, and John the 22nd had established him there. And from 1309 until 1377, the papacy was a non-resident bishop, which had always been seen as an abuse. And then Gregory the 11th said finally in 1377, I'm going to go back to Rome. We're going to move the papacy back to Rome. He does, and he dies. I talked about this before. And I said I would come back to it here, and I will. Because what happened in 1378 was something that was known as the Great Western Schism. Now, this is the slide that is titled Conciliarism, and you'll see why in a second. But first I have to come back and pick up on the Great Western Schism, which I was going to talk about last lecture. I kind of very much abbreviated it, even though I talked or signified it, that I would do more now. Because what happened in the Great Western Schism is there was a split election. Now, I may have mentioned that too, but let's look more about how that works together. This is the slide, the Great Western Schism, because, well, there's also confusion. The Great Schism often is referred to as what the split between the Latin Church and the Greek Church going back to 1054, when they agreed in 1054 that we won't have anything to do with each other. We will just accept that we're distinct. And for a long while, the Greek Church viewed the Latins as they're part of us, but not really. They're aberrant. They're kind of heretical almost. And the Latins viewed the Greeks in kind of the same way. There was desire on both sides to reunite, but it never was able to be brought about. But then in 1378, we have the initiation of the Great Western Schism, that often is just referred to as the Great Schism, but it should be seen as the Great Western Schism. Because after the death of Gregory XI, the College of Cardinals could not elect a new pope. The Roman people were demanding a Roman pope. They were demanding a Roman pope, or if not Roman, at least an Italian. John the 22nd had greatly expanded the College of Cardinals and had filled those positions with French cardinals. And there's a huge French influence in the College of Cardinals. But they felt themselves, anyway, to be completely under duress and coercion to elect. So when the College of Cardinals in 1378 elected Pope Urban as the Pope, they gave the people in Rome what they wanted. But then they said, you know what? That was under coercion and duress. An election is not valid under duress. You can't compel people to vote one way and have that be a valid election. So what we're going to do, because of all the chaos in Rome, we're going to go back to Avignon and vote and elect the Pope, which they did. And they elected Clement. Now, I think I did mention this briefly. The two sides had such political support that they could not be ignored. I mean, there had been anti-popes before. I mentioned, Louis of Bavaria's Nicholas V, but not having the political support. Both sides had political support, and there's a conflict. And what do we do when we have two popes? Who is in charge of the church? The idea was, well, without the Pope being there, you need to have a council, a general council to end the problem, which they did, and they finally called it in 1409. So 20 years after the schism, they finally got together to meet at Pisa to say we have to end the schism. And what they did was simply say, okay, we're going to tell both popes that they need to resign, because we have that basis in Celestine V had resigned the papacy. The Giles of Rome had defended in terms of the validity of Boniface's election. So both popes will resign and we'll elect a new pope, which they did. And so in 1409, they elected a third pope. The problem was that the other two popes, the Avignonese Pope, Pope in Avignon, and the Roman Pope, did not resign. And the Pisan Pope also had claims. They had sufficient political support. Now we had three popes. The church was becoming this hydra, not hydra, what it is, but many is multi-headed monster. Hydras with all the snakes. But different heads. The seamless robe of Christ had been torn asunder. You can't have two different heads. You can't have three different heads. What do we do about this? So they decided to get together, and they did it again. But they're going to do it right this time. So the Council of Constance, 1414, under the leadership or the guidance and the power of Emperor Sigismund, we have to deal with this problem. Because the whole issue was everything comes from the Pope. The Pope, Christ is the head of the church, but the Pope is the vicar of Christ. And so if you don't have a clear understanding of who the vicar of Christ is, how do we know how Christ's power comes to us? How do we ordain people? How do we celebrate the sacraments? That was all called into question. And the anxiety was huge. It was an intellectual problem, a political problem, a theological problem. It was also an existential problem of, oh my God, this level of conflict had never happened before. And I already pointed about the shock that Boniface is being mugged by Philip IV's troops sent through Europe, even though they were bad popes. Everybody knew they could criticize the Pope all you want, but you don't mug the Pope. But he had done that. This crossed the line. Now the Pope was not living in Rome; it was living in Avignon, which also was seen as an illegal heresy and an abuse. And now we have first two and then three popes. What is going on? How can we survive this? And the Council of Pisa is the solution is the General Council. When there's no president, we have to elect somebody new. Pisa failed terribly. Constance said we have to do it together. So the leading theologians in the universities, the head of religious orders, and the bishops and archbishops all got together at Constance and said, okay, what we're going to do is a couple of things. First, we're going to proclaim this council as the highest authority in the church. They did that with the decree Haec Sancta, which is there on the slide, the Great Western Schism. The decree Haec Sancta set the theory for what would become known as conciliarism, the council, the General Council. And Haec Sancta asserted that the highest authority on earth within the church is the General Council. So instead of the power structure going from Christ to the Pope to the council to everybody else, it went from Christ to the council to the Pope. And the Pope then would be seen as a CEO, kind of if you want to use those terms, whereas the council was the board of directors, and they really are the ones in charge. So they said, we are the ones in charge. We are the ones ruling the church. We have to be, because obviously when we have a problem with three popes and we can't figure that out, we are the ones to make possible Christ's power and influence on earth. And they said, not only are we going to make that proclamation for now to deal with this problem, to avoid future problems, we're going to establish the means for the council as the highest authority within the church to continue. And they did that with the decree Frequens. And Frequens just means, frequently. And it established the following. They said, okay, after we're done here in Constance, after we've solved all the problems, there'll be another General Council of the church in 5 years. Thereafter, there'll be another General Council in 7 years. Thereafter, there'll be another General Council in 10 years. And then every 10 years, there'll be a General Council of the church to make sure everything's going well. And we will get to finally electing a new pope. We're not going to do that first off like Pisa did. That was the problem. We're going to do that in the very last. So we are going to take care of church business here and now. They did that with Haec Sancta and Frequens, and then they had a number of reforming decrees. And they established the theory of conciliarism, which is a representative body as the primary authority. It worked. People went along with it as the means to end the schism. They also then tried to end some of the problems with heresy and put the church in order. The whole call was for a reformation in head and members. That was the call, to effect and bring about a reformation in head and members, head being the Pope, members being everybody else. And conciliarism by the Council Fathers at Constance was the response. That's what we're doing. We're effecting a complete reformation of how the church is organized and structured based on the power hierarchy. Christ still remains the head of the church, but that has to be filtered down through the church. It's like an electrical current. And the I don't know enough about electricity, but the connections were broken. The circuit was broken with two popes in the schism. Whereas with all the power, all the authority and power comes from Christ, but that has to be directly into the Pope and then everybody else. But when the Pope, when that circuit is cut, you have a power outage. That was the problem. Whereas if we establish and assert the council as the highest authority, when the Pope dies, it's not a problem. Because we are I can go into all kinds of more details on this in terms of the theory behind it, but that's what was going on. And so I just want to mention one other reform event that took place at Constance in dealing with heresy, because at the time there was in Bohemia, and the King of Bohemia was one of the imperial electors, kind of the area that became, well, in modern times, Czechoslovakia, now in the Czech Republic. There was a popular movement looking to a master of theology, or professor of theology at the University of Prague, as kind of their intellectual leader, a man by the name of John Huss. And Huss was critical of the way things were going in the church. Just for one thing, he claimed that that everybody should receive communion in both kinds, both the bread and the wine. It was completely the standard as accepted practice that the priest would commune in both kinds, the bread and the wine, the elements of the Eucharist, but the laity would only be given the bread. They didn't want to spill Christ's blood. Also, I can say a lot about that. It's really fun stuff, but I need to try to finish this lecture. So there's a popular movement and an intellectual positions. And the popular movement was called the Hussites, the Hussite movement, followers of Jan Hus, or John Huss, but in Czech it's Jan. So the Council Fathers of Constance said we should address this. Let's bring Huss here to talk with him, to really see what's going on. Is he really heretical? Or is it just like, okay, let's deal with some of these critiques and problems, because we're dealing with critiques and problems. The church had critiques and problems all along. They say, please come to Constance. And Huss says, no. I can smell a witch hunt, so to speak. Now, this is before the time of the witch hunts, so that's not an issue. The witch hunts had not begun yet in the early 15th century. That's the late 15th century where the first witch hunts, even inklings, start beginning. It's really a 16th and 17th century phenomenon. But meaning, John says, this is a trap. I'm not going to go to Constance. Emperor Sigismund said, Master Huss, we just want to talk to you. I give you my safe conduct, which means I will ensure your safety. So Huss said, based on that, okay, I have the imperial confirmation of my safety. I will go to Constance to talk with them. He did. There was fierce preaching against him. He was condemned as a heretic and burned at the stake in Constance. Theory was, well, the emperor granted him safe conduct, yeah, but once you're a condemned heretic, there's no basis for protecting a condemned heretic. This is a cancer. He was condemned for a number of reasons. Number one, questioning the hierarchical structure of the church as a divine institution. For also adhering to heretical doctrines of an English theologian by the name of John Wycliffe, who in the later 14th century had written a treatise on the church, and Huss wrote a treatise on the church, criticizing the established order. Now, Wycliffe was controversial at the time, but he died before he was ever brought up on charges. I mean, it's in the 1380s or so, so we're dealing with in the midst of the schism, but not the power structure. Other problems were going on. And just to make good on their promise and their condemnation of Huss and burning Huss, they also dug up Wycliffe and burned his bones, just for good measure. Now, again, the issue here is heresy was a cancer. I'm not advocating for burning heretics, but if we cannot understand why heretics had to be burned, we're not going to understand the Middle Ages. Not every heretic was burned. I mean, there was censorship all along, and positions could be condemned. You were always given a chance to recant. You were given opportunities to acknowledge your errors when the church so determined. So it wasn't, there was no witch hunt, as we later see. Let's go out and find witches and we'll just throw them in and burn them. That was never the case in the Middle Ages. Also for heretics. It was only belligerent, consistent heretics who were incorrigible and were not open to be taught and corrected. They didn't give Huss much time. He was there at the council. Instead of talking to him, they just preached against him, let's say, theoretically, held a mock trial, and then burned him. Now, this will also be important for next week's lecture. The next lecture, not next week's, next lecture with Luther. According to tradition, Huss said as he's on the stake, we're going to the stake, he says, "You may burn this goose." Goose was a play on his name in Czech. I don't know Czech, so I can't explain it exactly. But supposedly Huss kind of meant goose. He says, "You may burn this goose, but a swan is coming whom you will not be able to put down." He was burned. We'll come back to that next lecture. But that was what was going on in the schism. And they thought they had everything taken care of. They had dealt with heresy in the church, with the counter movements in Bohemia. They had dealt with the problem of the schism. They had completely reformed the church, complete reformation of the hierarchical structure with the church, with conciliarism. And then finally, before they closed shop, they elected Martin V as the new pope. Now, they closed shop in 1418. They weren't meeting consistently for those 4 years, but different sessions over those 4-year periods, because a general council is a major, major, major undertaking to have everybody there in one place. So they had done their job. They were successful. And now they had the new pope, who would be serving as the CEO, appointed by the board of directors of the council. And there would be a new council in 5 years, so in 1423, to make sure everything was going fine. And in 1423, there was a council, another council of Pisa. They looked at things and said, yeah, things are going pretty well. Things are going pretty well. So they closed up shop in 1424. So according to Frequens, the next general council was to be in 1431, 7 years, 5, 7, 10. And it was held. The Council of Basel opened in 1431. By this time, the Pope was Eugenius IV. Martin V, started to do everything he could to regain papal privilege and authority and power. In the popes after Martin, leading up to Eugenius, who was a very strategic canon lawyer in the vein of Boniface and John the 22nd. Eugenius is another one. And Eugenius wants to assert his authority over the council. At Basel, which opens in 1431, there had been talks about reuniting the Greek and the Latin churches. The Greek church was being threatened by Islam, by the Turk. Patriarch was calling out for help. What do we do? If we could somehow unite as a united Christian front against our common enemy, the infidel, the Turk, that could help. But to do that, we had to settle a lot of our issues. And so let's send a delegation, the Greeks thought, the Patriarch, Archbishop of Constantinople thought, we'll send a delegation to Basel. They're having this big council, try to work this all out. And Eugenius is great. He portrayed himself as the one who had brought about this potential for reunion. And so when the discussions are ongoing and things are working pretty well, and a proclamation of reunion was reached between the Eastern and the Greek churches, Eugenius is sitting pretty. And he then decides to say, and I'm going to move the council. I'm going to move it from Basel, first to Ferrara, and then Florence, or Florence and then Ferrara. It's going to be the same council, it's just we're moving cities back to Italy from Basel, which is in Switzerland. This caused a new conflict. Because of Eugenius' authority and what he had accomplished, most of the council members and people in attendance followed Eugenius to Florence and Ferrara to say, we will follow you. But there were those individuals who said, wait a minute, no, you work for the council. You can't do that. And they said, we're staying in Basel, became known as the Rump Council of Basel. What was happening was it was threatening a new schism. And the Rump Council of Basel from 1439 until 1441 never had any authority or support, or very limited support, whereas Eugenius had the support. Moves in 1438, and then 1439 closes up shop. Everything is great. Delegation from Constantinople went back, proclaimed the reunion, but then when they talked about the details, the Archbishop and the Patriarch said, absolutely not, because one of the details was recognizing the supremacy of the Pope. And they said, no, we're not doing that. Therefore, no help was coming. And Constantinople fell in 1453 to the Turks. Why did people go along with Eugenius? Because the council was a representative body. There were other representative bodies called parliaments. England had a parliament. France had a States General. The Empire had the Reichstag. All representative bodies of the monarch, the emperor, the king of France, king of England. If you're king, you don't want to say, oh, but the parliament is above me. I just work for the parliament. Or if I'm king of France, I just work for the Estates General. Or if I'm emperor, I just work for the Reichstag. No way. They had the political leaders, the kings and emperor, allowed the theory of conciliarism to settle the problem of the schism. But they weren't big supporters of conciliarism. And so after Eugenius moved the council, they all went with him. Now, according to Frequens, there should have been another council in 10 years. 5 years there was, 10 years there was. I have it there, so I'm just looking at Council of Basel of 44. I'm not sure if it was 44 or 41. Anyway, it continued. So in 39, because the Rump Council of Basel never had legitimacy, so the Council of Basel under Eugenius, even after it moves to Florence and Ferrara, is seen as being from 1431 to 1439. So in 10 years, it should have been in 1449. Was there a council in 1449? No. Was there a council in 1459? No. 69? No. 79? No. The next General Council of the Church did not meet until the Fifth Lateran Council in 1512, which we'll talk about later. I have up there on the slide Pius II and Execrabilis of 1462. That's because in 1462, Pope Pius II issued a papal bull, Execrabilis, in which he proclaimed calls for a council above the heads of the Pope are condemned as heretical. The very theory of conciliarism is heretical. The Pope is the head of the Church, and a general council can only be legitimate when called by the Pope. The Pope would need help sometimes, just as the Emperor would need help from the support of the Reichstag, or the King of France from the Estates General, or the Parliament, or the King of England with the Parliament. Those representative bodies would be called into session only when the monarch would call them into session to help with what he wanted to do. And Pius II is the same for the papacy. You cannot call for a council in opposition to the Pope. A council only has legitimacy when it's called by the Pope. The theory of conciliarism is condemned. Makes sense. Makes perfect sense. The conciliar position of the Pope just serving as an office for the council, as a representative body of the church, smelled far too much like Marsilius of Padua's Defensor Pacis, which no one really accepted, even though Louis of Bavaria agreed with it for the imperial superiority. The problem was, when you look more into the details of Marsilius's treatise, I'm not going to go into all of that, the theory was that the locus of sovereignty was really with the people, called popular sovereignty, whereby the defender of the peace, or the legislator, as Marsilius termed it, could be a prince, could be a king, could be the city council. There's reasons not to support Marsilius of Padua. There's even more reasons not to support conciliarism by the monarchs and leaders of Europe, and certainly of the Pope. This we'll see is an issue later on. Now, this whole problem, and in the context of the Great Schism and the conciliar movement, another movement was developing among the religious orders and the mendicant orders, the observant reform movement, because there was a sense that, why is everything going to hell? We need to return to our ideals, the very values of our rules and constitutions. We need to be truly religious. And this, too, is a long story, and I've argued and traced the origins of this back to 1354 with this one Augustinian hermit, Antonius Ramphagolus, who started talking about the truly religious, who really follow their vows and their constitutions and their rule. In order to do so, they have to be kept separate from those riffraff brothers who aren't really doing the case. Now, that split, that keeping separate, became the hallmark of what became known as the observant movement. Observant because we are going to be the ones who are really bringing about reformation and really doing what we're supposed to be doing. Those known as the observant movements. It's very prevalent in the Augustinian order, in the Franciscans, the Dominicans, a little bit in the Benedictines too, but primarily among the Mendicants. And it brought about a split within the orders and a schism within the orders, and even to the point of having dual administrative structures. It was a real problem, at least dual administrative structures on the lower levels. Still, they were all under the prior general, and the observant movement, those people who really wanted to reform, had the approval of the prior general. So there wasn't a split in that way, but in terms of district vicars and leaders, there was a dual administrative structures of the observants, as they were called, and of the conventuals, as they were called, just the conventual Augustinians, the conventual Franciscans. There was a split underneath the single hierarchy, all underneath the prior general. The point here is that the observant reform movement called for reformation, and that when a cloister had been introduced as part of the observance, it was talked about introducing the Reformation. There's also, I'll talk more about this next time too, a movement of princes, especially in Germany, to force the observant movement on cloisters to say, if you are not going to reform yourselves, I will introduce the Reformation from above to impose upon you the stricter orders and stricter rules and regulations. So there began to be within the Mendicant orders, the Augustinians, the Franciscans, the Dominicans, this tension between the observants and the conventuals, where the observants viewed themselves as we are the truly religious, and this is the only hope for the church. Similarly, on the lay level, in terms of feeling of the anti-clericalism, that we have to take everything upon ourselves because the priests aren't doing our jobs. Within here, the religious orders, at least the mendicants, there's this sense of we've lost it. We've gone away from our ideals, our perspectives, our following our rule, and following our constitutions. We have to be truly religious to bring about reformation, and we have to introduce reformation as much as we possibly can. And not only that, but we've convinced, especially in Germany, some of the princes to do that too, because again, the princes going all the way back still have this sense of, if I'm a prince, if I'm a duke or a count or a king, certainly, I'm responsible for my people. Physically, but also spiritually. And if I want to have the best monastic life in my territory, that's the observance. So I'm going to try to force every monastic house in my territory to become reformed, to introduce the Reformation and be an observant congregation. This was later referred to as the Prince's Reformation, because the whole point of introducing the observance was the introducing of the Reformation. That's what it was seen as. And that led to this division and conflict, as well as the increased calls for a reformation that must be brought about. Now, Luther was a member of the observant branch of the Augustinian hermits in Erfurt. I'll talk more about that next time. But this call for Reformation heads and members, which explicitly began in the context of the schism, in which I've traced back and argued begins really with the early 14th century and the onset of the crisis, both politically in terms of the famine and the plague and the 30 Years' War and the conflicts that's going on, including the development of Italian humanism, which is criticizing the standard acceptable traditional educational system. And that movement just started spreading north of the Alps in the 15th century and on later into the 15th century. So there's, and we'll talk about it next time too, there's the term Reformation in the university context often meant a humanist reformation, reforming the curriculum. We have the introduction of the Reformation in the religious orders. We also then have this treatise written somewhere approximately 1439 in context of the Council of Basel, or shortly after the Council of Basel, called the Reformation of the Emperor Sigismund. This treatise, the Reformation of 1431, sorry, but it's still new about Basel. I'll say that anyway. This Reformation of the Emperor Sigismund, an anonymous treatise. It's been speculated or assumed it was written by a secular priest, i.e. not one of the religious orders, but someone attached to, let's say, the imperial court. Emperor Sigismund died, I forget exactly when, but he was dead by the time of the Council of Basel. He was not the author of this treatise. This anonymous author referred to this and wrote this treatise and gave it the title The Reformation of the Emperor Sigismund. It became the most widely known treatise calling for Reformation in the later Middle Ages. Anybody dealing with Reformation knew about it and had read it. It is an amazing treatise. It's an amazing work. It calls for Reformation in headed members from the Pope, the Emperor, the College of Cardinals, onto bishops, onto parish priests, into then taxes and tolls and customs and how to treat the peasantry. It's a complete, very relatively short, but complete program for reformation of society at large. And it's based on this assumed vision that Sigismund had, supposedly. We don't know if Sigismund actually had this vision, but supposedly the Emperor Sigismund had this vision in 1401 or 1402 that a reformation was needed, a vision divine intervention, that everybody was falling by the wayside. And this treatise is, it starts out with this condemnation of all the leaders. We had the chance of a true reformation of Basel, or at Constance. And what did everybody, the church fathers, the council fathers, do? They showed their ass to the truth. They didn't bring about any real change or reformation. And God is angry, and God is coming, and a reformation and a reformer to bring about reformation is coming. And they said this was revelation of Emperor Sigismund. And this reformer that will be coming, his name will be Frederick of the New Land. And he will be fierce, and he will impose reformation from above. So basically, get on board. And then it offered the plan for how to do so, how to get on board. Because when this reformer to come is coming to affect and bring about reformation, he says, you don't want to be in opposition. You don't want to be on the other side. Join with him. Support him. He will be a king after the order of Melchizedek, both a king and a priest. And basically, he's just going to come in and kick butt and put things in order. And it says, this is coming. This will happen. We need to work towards that reformation. That was the tenor of this treatise, and this was very widespread and known. So this is all getting at the context of what would come about in the 16th century, and that's why I talk about the failure of the late medieval Reformation, because even though there's all these attempts to bring about Reformation, effective Reformation, it never really changed all that much until the 16th century. Failure. How do we measure it? I'll talk about failure of Luther's Reformation next lecture too, I think. That's what we're getting at. And just because it didn't transform church and society, so to speak, doesn't mean it wasn't these urgent calls for it. Whether it's Huss's prophecy, whether it's the Emperor Sigismund's prophecy of his vision that was attributed to Sigismund, in the context of the schism, the failure of the church, and yet the Pope Pius II in 1462 condemned conciliarism, so that even makes it further away from the Reformation platform that had been advocated. What do we do? What do we do? And what's going to happen if the reformer does come? That was expected and looked for, as prophesied by Huss in the Reformation of the Emperor Sigismund, named Frederick. And we'll talk about that next lecture. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.